people were unable to attend, or they want to go back for some reference, certainly they can do so. So my name is Kelly Lendsay, President and CEO of Indigenous Works. Great to have everybody here today. And it'll be Craig Hall and myself doing this presentation. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territories of Treaty 6 and the Métis homeland of Saskatchewan in very snowy Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Craig, you'll do his Latin knowledge to tell you where he's speaking from, but it's the other side of Canada. So today we are in our thought leadership session. This is part of our monthly knowledge capital, or what we call the thought leadership sessions. We've got this navigating Indigenous employment program. Today we're going to focus more on truth and reconciliation, why it's part and should be part of your reconciliation strategies, your corporate strategy. And I think bring some insights here that you'll be able to incorporate into your work going forward. So in terms of our work with you, we are building out our community of practice. We're really thrilled that we have a national corporate organizational partner in ICD.D. It's a Canadian Center for Diversity and Inclusion. And we announced this in August, late August, and we're now rolling this out. And really, ICD.D has done some great work on diversity and inclusion leadership in this country. And of course, their Achilles heel or their weakness was in the Indigenous side. So by us partnering together, we're going to be able to bring new programs and services to corporate Canada, to academic communities, and to the public service sector and the education sector, so you can advance your inclusion strategies. So check this out. For members that belong to both the ICD.D organization and to Indigenous Works, we're going to be hosting next year the first what we're calling the Dreammaker Summit. It'll be for those members that belong to both organizations. So we continue to be building out our thought leadership and learning programs. Next fall, we're scheduling our virtual Inclusion Works event. So we made a decision to go virtual, and then we'll look at the following year in terms of an in-person gathering. And our job board has doubled in activity, so we're just seeing growth in all aspects. The number of training sessions we've done have tripled this year. So again, you're busy, we're busy, and it's just been a great journey. So today, what we want to do is again a little more background on TRC, what led up to this. I want to give you some specific examples out of the TRC report, the response, the relevance today, and then we'll get into some Q&A. So again, you know about us, created in 1998. We came out of the RCAP report, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. There was 430 recommendations in that report, and we were one of them. And so we've been focused on workplace inclusion strategies, systems, models, training, and over 22 years, Craig, that we've been going at this. And the world is full of disruption. I mean, labor market disruptions, 50% of the jobs are going to change, but part of all of this change is what's happening on the social and the economic side. And part of this is the TRC. So the TRC really came out of the Indian residential school legacy settlement. And the gentleman who really broke this open was our former Grand Chief, Phil Fontaine. And I remember Phil telling me that at the time, he was a residential school survivor. He was told even by members of his community and even some members of his family to keep it quiet. Don't say anything. And so you can see the tension that it created inside the Native community. And he was courageous. He came out, he spoke about being raped physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And that really sparked this residential school settlement legacy. And then that led to the truth and reconciliation. So again, it didn't just sort of it didn't just appear. It was through a more sort of deliberate process here. The residential school legacy, of course, we know about Canada's history of residential school, but you got to put it in context. There is also social, political, economic exclusion in addition to this education exclusion. For example, Ceremonies were outlawed. The potlatch was outlawed. You could not gather in groups of 6 or more. Matriarchal systems were disbanded. That's part of the social exclusion. Political exclusion. Heard of the Indian Act? Well, it creates a whole set of standards and oversight and fiduciary responsibilities for Indians. And the economic exclusion. Could not hire a lawyer to take the government to court on land claims. You could not sell your grain on the open exchange, et cetera, et cetera. So you got to put it in context, folks, that there was a number of exclusionary policies working together. The reserve system pushed Native folks away from some of the most fertile growing areas, resources, and so on. All of that combined is really, I think, an important in terms of setting the context for TRC. And you're going to see when we get into this that TRC touches almost every aspect of society. So we know about the lasting impacts of exclusion. And we know that there have been a number of studies, and the one we're going to highlight here is the 2019 report from the National Indigenous Economic Development Board. So they have a number of indicators: employment, income, community well-being, then there's entrepreneurship, housing, education levels, and so on. And what's rather lamentable is that, you know, the sort of the key paragraph, Craig, in the report is sort of goes to the effect that although there's been some modest progress in some areas, overall there has been very little change in the economic socio circumstance of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. So not a really good indicator report card. And it shows you why the work that you folks are doing, the work of our employer partners, is so important. That it is about addressing this broader area of what we call well-being. And we're going to talk a bit more about that later, Craig, in terms of what we mean by Indigenous well-being. So the report itself, the TRC report, has 94 calls to action. It provides important framing and a catalyst for action. Getting to the truth part has been very hard. We did not learn this history in our school systems. You folks and myself, we did not learn this in our K-12 systems. Today, it's being taught. There's curriculum, grade 4, grade 8, law schools, universities are requiring courses and implementing courses. So, but this knowledge was not taught. And I think this is the truth side of it. Really no different than learning about apartheid, learning about the genocide in Rwanda, learning about the Holocaust. I mean, these are the truth side of learning about the history, but doing this in our own backyard in Canada. So the reconciliation side is the action side. Now, I don't know about you folks, but sometimes the word reconciliation, to me, carries this tinge of guilt. Reconciliation, and people are coming at it from a sometimes almost like walking on eggshells, but one of, I don't want to do the wrong thing, I'm unsure. But if you look up the definition of reconciliation in the dictionary, it's the first one is building friendly relations. And if you talk to these elders, it's about looking forward. How do we create a new relationship? Friendly relationships, new strategies. It's supposed to have more optimism and ideas and energy and creativity to say, how can we reconcile? How can we build these relations together? How can we walk together? How can we work together? So keep this in the back of your mind as we go forward, that really, I believe, is the spirit and intent of what we're trying to do later. So when was this report released? 2015. It's now 6 years later. And I think this is where, Craig, I'm going to turn over to you. Here we are 6 years later, and let's look at what we mean by achieving reconciliation.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So yes, I'm Craig, and I am speaking to you from Mi'kma'ki, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people in Atlantic Canada. Now, before I go on, Kelly, I wanted to just pick up on something that you mentioned earlier. We skirted over it quickly. You mentioned the term well-being, and in the context of the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board. and their report on sort of progress being made. So I was wondering if you wanted to comment, because their set of metrics was very good, very fulsome. But as we have been going along this journey, we're aware that there's been more work being done on well-being and how that applies to Indigenous people in their context. So I wonder if you'd just like to fill in some of the background on that, because it's a very interesting area.
Sure, Craig. I think, folks, this idea of Indigenous well-being comes from the work that we're doing with Luminary, which is advancing Indigenous innovation. And the real question is, why do we want to harness this world of research and innovation? Well, it's about economic transformation, it's about jobs, but it's about creating this sense of well-being. What's really turned people onto this is COVID in Canada. All of a sudden we discovered it's not just employment in the workplace, it's mental health. Women 19 to 34 with a child, hardest hit by COVID. So it's these pressures around, what do we mean by well-being, housing, your health, education, social services. It's this multitude of your community and your experience where you live and interact. And we think that there is some Indigenous thinking that could inform on a well-being index. What's really interesting is, folks, is that there are now 22 nations around the world that have expanded their traditional definitions of GDP measures to include measures of well-being. You may have heard of the happiness index that was started in Bhutan. That was the beginning. Fast forward, the Prime Minister in New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, was really, I think, the first nation to implement these more expansive measures of well-being into their national federal budgets. Today, 22 nations are doing this. So it really fits with Indigenous thinking. It fits with a number of Indigenous worldviews, Craig, around the medicine wheel, looking at mental, physical, emotional, intellectual well-being. You've got the Inuit with their 8 societal principles. It'll include things like caring for the land, caring for each other. And they use words like this: caring and kindness, being innovative, being resourceful. You can look at two-eyed seeing from Albert Marshall. How do we respect both traditional and Western ways of knowing and doing to benefit all? So as we go forward, what we believe is that there is a connection here between reconciliation and these areas of well-being. We'll touch on some of those. I'll give you some examples a little bit later on.
Yeah, and Kelly, if you could go back a slide. Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say a few words about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report and the calls to action. So, a variety of calls to action. The neat thing is that when you read the report, you appreciate the thought that went into it and the fact that there is this appeal to all different echelons and institutions in Canada, whether it's the judicial, academic, the employers, and so on. And in each case, there's a call to action requesting that that these groups come together and bring new ideas forward with Indigenous people on how best to achieve reconciliation together. And it's something that is considered a journey. And Kelly went over one of the slides earlier in saying that really the Truth and Reconciliation reports offered an opportunity really to reframe how these new relationships could be cast and by what means and so on. So this is very much a journey. It's a multi-generation journey in Canada, but it's human nature to ask, how far have we come? So it's been now 6 years since we've done the 2015 reports, and there's tremendous interest among the corporate sector and other areas on how to achieve reconciliation and by what measures would we make that assessment. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about that for just a few moments. So, when you look at things like on the next slide, the Declaration of rights of Indigenous people. If you have a look at that document, it's easily available on the website. You'll see many rights that have been embedded over the years by the UN. And some of the provinces in Canada have now adopted this as a framework. And it's really driving a lot of the legislation, changes in the way governments and departments are looking at the way they do work and so on. But I'll read you one example of an article. Kelly, you mentioned housing earlier as a key thing. So Article 23 of the framework, the United Nations Declaration, says Indigenous peoples have the right to determine, develop priorities and strategies for exercising their right to development. In particular, Indigenous peoples have the right to be actively involved in developing and determining health, housing, and other economic and social programs affecting them, and as far as possible, to administer such programs through their own institutions. So this is an example of, there's an adoption of the declaration, but you can see that the actual effect of how that would be achieved through governmental processes, through transfers of responsibility over time, and the creation of ultimately new institutions among Indigenous people to achieve some of these aspirations. It will take some time, right? So this is part of the journey. The first step is sort of getting agreement that this is a useful framework to work with, and that these rights are to be enjoyed by Indigenous people. But it's a process, very much the case. On the next slide, a different sort of take on progress being made and reconciliation and how to measure progress. So there's a group led by Catherine Starzyk that are actually trying to create and have created a barometer for reconciliation. Now, there are barometers that have existed in countries like Australia, for instance, and every year or 2 years, they measure some of these key things through indicators. And I'm not yet sure how this is all going to work in this new barometer, but I came across a good recording from Starzyk and one of her colleagues. I believe it was in the Globe and Mail in their Decibel series. And they talked about how this survey will be developed. The survey has been developed. I think they're actually going to be publishing something in the fall of this year. And then through subsequent iterations of the survey, they'll be able to track, how far the progress has been met in some aspects of reconciliation. So I think it's an interesting response. I remember when the Truth and Reconciliation report first came out, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce actually produced a report that said, we're all in favor of reconciliation, but we're unclear as to what we as companies and employers should be doing, and what it means when we have done some success in this area. So people are looking for benchmarks. They're looking for milestones on how to best measure progress. A different approach is from texts like this one, which is really looking at the sort of more qualitative aspects of the journey itself and different experiences that people have had in making some inroads in pathways to reconciliation. And I think that these are very important for people and for companies to read and talk about the different experiences of employees and their own staff about how they're coming to grips with reconciliation, because I think it's both an organizational and a personal pathway that we're talking about. Next slide, I think that there has been an earlier attempt on a barometer led by Environics with the support of MasterCard and others. And That's sort of interesting reading. That was done about 2019. On the next slide, I guess I pulled an example. So their focus was been on Indigenous youth and trying to use Indigenous youth and their opinions as a kind of barometer on reconciliation, and with the view that presumably if you queried the same people year over year, and you'd see a slide in opinion, that this would be of some consequence. So, you know, to this question, when interacting with non-Indigenous people, how often would you would you say you feel respected or accepted for who you are or as an individual? And when interacting with non-Indigenous people, how often would you say your culture is respected? So the answer from individuals is all the time, all of the time, or most of the time. You can see the numbers there, only some of the time, and rarely. And so if we were to see different spreads on those numbers over the next few years, it would really show you that there are fundamental attitudes changing over time, and that people are embracing the spirit of reconciliation. So next slide. Kelly, maybe I'll turn back to you here, because I think that I've said what I wanted to do, which is sort of capture different ways that we're trying to measure how reconciliation is taking root in Canada.
So part of this, folks, is you are employers, and there is a TRC called Action 92, which I'll look at next. But I think you got to pull back and you got to look at what's happening overall. Missing and murdered children. You hear about Cindy Blackstock and the anger around, you know, with the government around child welfare. I don't know more movement. The graveside discoveries. So I think you got to, you know, we have to be paying attention to what's happening in the broader community and across society. And the reason you want to do this is the TRC speaks to this. So we already said, yes, the business sector, you folks, there are these calls to action 92, which is directed at the corporate sector. And the commission calls for, you know, educate your employees, more meaningful consultation, make sure there's long-term sustainable opportunities from economic development, adopt UNDRIP and free, prior, and informed consent. So indeed, you should do that. It costs you nothing except it costs a commitment. It should be on the radar screen of management and the board of directors. And you can use that actually as part of your recruitment and retention attraction strategies. We are committed, or we're developing a reconciliation action plan. We've signed on to this. Those are the types of things that an Indigenous workforce, many of these professionals are going to be looking for companies that are aligning with their priorities, and a lot of them are in the TRC recommendations. So that's important. But I want to say a bit more about this idea of more comprehensive strategies. And I don't know if you've actually looked at the report, but folks, if you print it out, here it is, 10 pages. I want to give you 3 examples of what's in this report that I think really then can layer over the corporate call to action 92. So here's corporate call action number 17. And it's under the heading of language and culture. So under language and culture, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 specific calls to action. Let me just read this to you. We call upon all levels of government to enable residential school survivors and their families to reclaim their names changed by the residential school system by waiving administrative costs for a period of 5 years for the name change process and the revision of official identity documents, birth certificates, passports, driver licenses, health cards, status cards, social insurance numbers, et cetera, et cetera. You get the idea. So look at this recommendation. You've got adults, you know, my age, my friend, some of them name changed, surnames were changed. They want to reclaim their original name. It was changed either by churches. If you look at the Inuit, for those of you that were on our webinar, we told you about Project Surname, where the Inuit surnames were changed to numbers, East or West Arctic, followed by a number. and there's 40 years of Inuit growing up, they thought their surname was a number. And that was called Project Surname. So you can see this is a very specific type of thing that roots itself in history, but contemporarily to change to go through all those documents, just imagine the cost. It's probably in the range of at least $500 to $1,000, $20 for this, $50, $100 for birth certificate. You get the picture, right? That there's a cost to doing this. That's how granular these recommendations got to, is they looked at the real issues facing Indigenous Canadians. And they said, there's a cost barrier here, and that's why we call upon government. So I thought that was kind of a cool one to share with you. Here's another one. It's under the label of justice. Under justice, there was about probably 10, no more, many, 14 or so calls to action. We call upon the law schools in Canada to require all law students to take a course in an Aboriginal people and the law, which includes the history and legacy of residential schools and so on. So it's the same recommendation as 9E2, which is you are to educate your employees, but this is to educate all lawyers who go through and become our lawyers in Canada. So again, you can sort of see very a far-reaching impact if we were to educate all lawyers about Indigenous peoples, issues, residential school, and so on. I want to give you one final one. So it has to do with the graveside discoveries. So you know Kamloops first, then Cowasis, and now there's many communities looking and undertaking searches for unmarked grave sites. So in the Truth and Reconciliation Report, under the section Missing Children and Burial Information, that's the title, let me read to you Call to Action 73. We call upon the federal government to work with churches, Aboriginal communities, and former residential schools students to establish and maintain an online registry of residential school cemeteries, including, where possible, plot maps showing the location of deceased residential school children. And number 74, we call upon the federal government to work with the churches and the Aboriginal community and leaders to inform the families of children who died at residential schools of the child's burial location and to respond to family wishes for appropriate commemoration ceremonies and markers and reburial in home communities where requested. So I think you can understand some of the cynicism, and criticism of Indigenous folks. This was in 2015. What has now sparked this into action? The gravesite discoveries. And now we're finding out many of the records of these children. They reside with the church, but they're not residing in Canada. They're actually at the Vatican. So we're going to need the federal government to demand of the Vatican that they release that information. So you can sort of see these are very, very specific. And I think you as leaders need to know these, because it makes sense what's on the news. It makes sense when people are pounding the table over, the church has to give us this information. You got to take away the mysticism and the confusion to say, oh, that's why. It's really, these calls to action are dealing with pertinent issues today. Employment, of course, is critical. And that's where we love the work that you folks are doing in terms of building, enterprise-wide strategies, implementing, our navigating employment program. So you're creating opportunities for Indigenous people in this whole economic and employment space. It's critical. We still are facing a number of barriers from the boardroom into management programs, into many sectors that aren't engaged with Indigenous inclusion. So again, this work that you're doing and the work that we're doing to support you is important, but I hope that you can start to contextualize it with some of the other elements that Craig and I spoke to in TRC. I think this, to us, I think we've all looked at this too narrowly. And so that's why we designed this particular webinar with a very different focus today, which is how do you look at TRC? And not that you have to act on every action, but you need to be aware and knowledgeable of it. I think it will help you personally. It'll help your company in a corporate strategy planning sense, and it will help you understand why communities may be making certain requests of you in their work with you. So you got, Craig, you mentioned the barometer report. Australia does do their reconciliation barometer report. We always thought this is where Canada needs to go, is you can do these darn reports and all these and calls to action, but unless you have some way to measure and have a report card and so on, you know, they get left on a shelf. So we sort of applaud the work of Manitoba and some other folks that are looking at barometer measures. We think it's going to help. Plus, it starts to give you ideas. Let's copy what others have done that have been successful. I mean, you would copy a recipe, so let's copy recipes where reconciliation actions and strategies are working. So that's in, I think in summary, we're going to turn to some Q&A here. Don't worry about taking notes. You get a copy of the deck. You can use it and again share it internally. So we make it into a PDF, and you'll be able to get a copy of this. So let me stop sharing here, and you can use the you know the routine, folks. You can put a question into the Q&A, or you can come off mute and ask your question.
I always like the Q&A stuff because it people come at this from very different angles sometimes.
Yeah. Here we go. Oh, there it is, chat. Okay. Okay, Kelly, can you expand more on the records? Yeah, so this just came out a few weeks ago, is that a number of Indigenous groups have asked the federal government to put pressure on the Catholic Church to release records. And indeed, I do believe that the Catholic bishops, so not the Pope has apologized, but the Catholic bishops, I understand, have apologized and have been very cooperative. So I know this third hand through my conversations, Matthew, but what's now reported is that the records of many of these children and so on are not in Canada. They're literally over in the Vatican. So again, this is public knowledge now. It was reported. So now you're hearing some noise. Indigenous leaders are going to meet with the Pope. You're hearing some noise and demands that if there's going to be a meeting, it has to include an apology. But moreover, it's back to this records and information. So stay tuned. We're going to be learning more. And like I said, you know, people don't know what they don't know. As far as you know, and I know, those Catholic bishops, many of them may have learned themselves that this information is over at the Vatican. I don't know. But the point is, we cannot get at the truth without this data, or it'd be very difficult. And so this is the truth side of the equation, reconciliation to follow. What about, you know, I remember when reconciliation efforts, there was a guy in Manitoba, and he reached out to me, and he was a non-native guy, lived in Winnipeg, and he started he did 10 sharing circles with 10 people for 10 months in a row. And that was his idea. And he just started these, right? And I thought, you know, there's some very, very interesting reconciliation efforts. You know, I always remember Van City. They orchestrated and invested in a parade, a march, Craig, right? Mm-hmm. Like big money, over $1.5 million they invested and supported, but they wouldn't speak about it publicly. They didn't want to appear to be bragging or, you know, doing this for different purposes, right? And I said, no, you've got to tell our communities, this is impressive what you're doing. You're getting people marching and walking together. So maybe you folks have heard of some very interesting reconciliation actions and activities that have been underway. And if you have, share them. I think you could send them in to us. We could create a collection. and then circulate them back to our members. So there comes your recipe book. So there you go. We'll make that offer now. If you can each send us some of either what you're doing or you've heard others are doing, send them to us. We'll compile them into a recipe book and be able to bring them back to you. That's knowledge capital at work. Does anybody want to share one? Come off mute and share an idea and or an example. Steve.
Hi, Kelly. And hi, Craig. Maybe
Hi.
I'll just, I don't think we're necessarily in a position to be, you know, a wonderful example by any stretch, but I think at BHER, we've been trying to at least put a foundation on the development of a reconciliation strategy. So we've been running some internal workshops, building out our own internal understanding, talking about relationship building. And now we're at the stage where we're starting to bring in some Indigenous organizations or individuals to meet with us. But I guess to put it back to you as a question, there's a bit of a push and pull where we understand that we aren't equipped to do this on our own, and we want to have Indigenous perspectives informing the development of that reconciliation plan. But it's also not always appropriate to expect Indigenous speakers to come and have to re-explain the history of residential schools and the legacy of colonization. And so maybe, I guess I'm wondering if you have any insight on the appropriate way to go about building that plan and engaging with Indigenous organizations and people, and when is the appropriate time to do that?
Sure. Well, first of all, congratulations on bringing people in. I think bringing a real face to issues is important. It creates a real connection, often creates obviously relationships, right? So good on you. And I think that kind of real person touch, whether it's online or in person, is important. You can take that a step further. I know that look, we need to avoid criticisms, and some of these criticisms are deserved in the sense that if you're designing things without any input from Indigenous people, I mean, you're kind of opened yourself up. So creating advisory bodies to inform on your strategy, or a working group or a committee. I mean, you need to create the right type of network to apprise your strategy. It's not done just from a risk point of view. It's done from a value creation. You do get a better product. You get a better strategy with that kind of input. And I do think you need to look at how you segment that input. So yes, you can look at the markets where you work. You need to look at First Nations, Métis, Inuit. And then I want you to segment it. I think you need, just like if you were talking about Canadian people, you'd say, you know, under 25, millennials, boomers, Generation X, how do they, you know, so do the same, get a cross section of Indigenous people. And I think so often we try to go to, you know, high profile leaders and so on, and a cross section of them are good. But I think if you can get the working level program manager, you know, these are the people with their feet on the ground. They're working on, you know, real tangible things. They're a director of a program, you know, Indigenous housing program, like Craig mentioned, and so on. I think those people bring some really interesting insights. And again, many of my friends are the chiefs or CEOs of organizations, but I think a lot of the knowledge capital resides in these, you know, managers and directors of programs, and I'd encourage you to look to those people as you build out your strategies. Craig?
I'd also add that you know, you look at organizations like National Film Board and CBC. There's just an amazing archives there of firsthand testimony and stories about the varied sort of perspectives on reconciliation and the history. And I think that part of what we're trying to do with reconciliation is co-develop a new narrative around history, one that is honoring of Indigenous people and what they have experienced, and and non-Indigenous and making them more aware. So sometimes having films and things like that just being shown in groups of different audiences within your organization can be a real springboard for great conversation. And it's a very sort of cost-effective way of sparking some new kind of avenues in your conversation.
Yeah. You know, Carolyn Bennett came out one day when she was minister of CERNA, so Crown Indigenous Relations, and she said, and I like these simple ideas. If you are in a book club, read an Indigenous author this year or this month. Craig, to your point, watch the National Film Board, watch a movie, then create a discussion circle, sharing circle in your company. You know, some of you have lunch and learns. That's just incorporate that into your EDI strategy or your DNI strategy. So I think you're sparking these conversations. Look at the conversation we just had about the churches and so on. Create a conversation, a place for people to talk about this. I think this kind of dialogue is going to help educate your employees, bring out different opinions, and I think there will be. I mean, Indigenous people also have different views, and you know, I always joke that we're like the provinces and territories. Try and get us all in the same room to agree on one plan of action. I mean, look at COVID with 13 provinces and territories. I mean, I don't want to get going on my Rick Mercer rant on COVID strategies. But Steve, I hope that helps. And like you said, I think I do like more and more thinking about this recipe book, giving people, and there have been some sites and so on where people have started to promote what they're doing. Someone's asked a question here about the right to roam. I'm just going to read it. Hi, what about the right to roam? So I'm reading this because I do not know about the right to roam. And it says, especially on unceded territories, it seems a good way to make a real move toward respecting the right of Indigenous. The right to roam would give the possibility to anyone to walk on private properties away from buildings. More than 10 countries have such laws, such as Sweden, Switzerland. So can you speak to that a bit more?
Sorry. My name is Boris Lamontagne. Yeah, I read this in a small local newspaper. Someone was suggesting as a way to promote reconciliation is to give back the right or the way territories were used in the past, and just to share the land and have open possibilities to wander around, to pick berries, to do some hiking anywhere. To me, it's a good way to promote access to nature, and as well as doing a concrete move toward the reconciliation.
Boris, thank you for that great explanation. I love it. I mean, look, we're talking about building social capital. I mean, just the examples you used. I mean, we've always said to people, go visit an Indigenous community if you've never been to one. Go to a powwow, go to a Métis settlement, an Inuit community. But, you know, you took it further, you know, pick berries. But this is where it gets into an interesting partnership. You could find some Indigenous communities that would say, you know what, heck yeah, I do want people coming onto our territories, and they could actively promote things like berry picking. We'll share our best, you know, Saskatoon berry picking areas and so on, or maybe keep some of them secret, but we'll tell you about some of them. And so Boris, you can see this is a two-way collaboration. It would take organizations and companies working with communities to create that that marketing message and that invitation. But I in principle, I love it. I think that kind of social capital is what's going to be the precursor. There was a great study out of the OECD, so the Organization for Economic Development, said nations like Switzerland and Sweden, who you just referenced, nations with higher social capital have better labor market outcomes. And social capital is the bonds and the linkages between and among groups of people. So your idea is speaking directly to that. So
It it also refers to look on the web about it. It also refers to issues that took place, I think, in the West, where people were gathering on small hills, and because it were private properties, it caused a lot of frictions. Just the fact that we see so many no trespassing sign all around in nature, and you want to go walk on a mountain, you cannot have access. Is that type of thing that is frustrating for everyone. Probably even more for Indigenous that used to have the right to hunt and to fish everywhere.
What I really like too is I'm assuming you're speaking from Quebec.
I'm in Ottawa, but yeah, I'm from Quebec originally. Yeah.
Okay, so when I've been in Quebec many times, I've heard people reference both Indigenous and mainstream Quebecers about the two solitudes. And I can't say it in French, but the two solitudes, and they talk about. So what your idea is going right to this about breaking that down with right to roam. Very great idea.
Very good. Now, this is our NRC Day. Lynn has a question as well. So, Lynn, did you want to raise your question? You said something about residential schools.
Hi, guys. Can you hear me okay?
Hi. Yeah, we can.
So thanks. I wanted to attend today really just to kind of broaden my education on the issue. I recently read From the Ashes, by the way, since you mentioned reading a book, Kelly. My question is really about the facts, some of the facts surrounding residential schools, and please excuse my ignorance, but I read that they started in the late 1800s and that the last one actually closed in 1996, which was quite surprising to me. Were they, like, how pervasive were they across the country? Were they concentrated more in certain parts of the country? How was a community, I don't know, targeted, or like, did it affect all communities broadly? Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Well, there was over 130 schools built, and some of the older ones like Alert Bay with the Hyde in 1882 and so on, but it was coordinated. Again, going back to this coordination with the church, the Northwest Mounted Police. So, they would be escorted, you go, and people say, well, why would you let your child go? Well, you could be put in jail. So there was the threat of imprisonment and so on. But they were extensive. In America, they called them industrial schools. So there are residential schools in America. They're industrial schools. They're also in Australia, right? So again, many nations sort of follow Canada's lead. They look to Canada, including apartheid, and adopted things like a reserve system, a pass system, a residential school system, right? So we were sort of the early leaders, unfortunately, in this area. You can go to the TRC website and so on, and there'll be a map of residential schools that you can see and where they were located. But it affected Inuit, Métis, First Nations across the lands.
And where would people go after residential school?
Oh, good question. So, I mean, children entered as early as 4 and 5. And you generally exited at 15, generally 15, right? Because you were labor force ready, right? So they didn't keep you, they weren't designed to get you into Rhodes Scholar schools, right? You didn't stay on. You exited, and like Irene Lendsay, she's one of our grandmothers, one of our elders. You folks have met her. Many of you have met Irene Lendsay. She lives in Ottawa, but she's from One Arrow, just north of Batoche in Saskatchewan here. And she left residential school in Saskatchewan, and at age 13, she went to Ottawa to work as a caregiver, a nanny type job. And then later met her husband, sort of 5 or 6 years later, and made her life there, right? But that's the story of many folks now. And then regrettably and lamentably, I mean, many of them left, and now the story of incarceration, abuses, dysfunction, and for the lucky ones like Irene, found some type of career path.
So would you say that most people weren't able to reconnect with their families, or was
No,
that?
they were lost, and then so were their families. I mean, everyone, you have to look at survivors, but look at the families who were left behind. There are communities that had no children with no laughter. And, you know, I've been told these stories, but just, it's hard to imagine a community, a town, a village, or a reserve without laughter, right? But that's what you had, because all the kids were gone. So I think people, you know, the amount of dysfunction that then just crept from generation to generation to generation, both on this, on the survivor, the victim side, but also for families and communities, and just how it impacted them.
Thanks, Kelly.
I was going to add as well that certainly there's such a range of stories from people who attended the residential schools, some with very terrible experiences. We've been holding recently sharing circles with people who attend post-secondary institutions now, and some of them are more mature students and attenders of residential schools. And there was one lady recently who talked about her experiences, who was explaining that any sort of aspiration that she had for higher education were quickly quashed in the residential school environment, and people sort of taking her aside and saying, you know, this is as far as you'll go. You'll never, so don't have lofty ambitions about going to school, right? Afterwards. So, I mean, look at the tremendous impact that would have on a youngster and their decision to pursue higher education or not. So very different experiences. I know I've talked to lots of people up north who went to these schools, and I can remember one Métis guy saying, very ambivalent feelings. He said, the nuns were really tough, no question, but they equipped us with skills for reading and writing and being able to navigate the white man's world. And this individual had lots of residual psychological issues, but he was, in a strange way, very grateful for that experience. So there's very, very sad and negative stories, and some who have put a different framing on it.
I'll conclude with one last story. Yesterday, I told you I spoke at my first in-person conference. It was in Regina at an Indigenous Agribusiness conference, and Chief Cadmus Delorme was there, and he's the chief, folks, at Cowessess that has signed with Trudeau the first child welfare transfer agreement in Canada. All right. So back to what Craig was saying about building institutions for housing, child welfare, and so on. When the Cowessess, so I told the audience, and told Chief Delorme, I said, when he was on the news, breaking the news about the Cowessess gravesite, 751 grave sites, they interviewed an elder from his community. And she said, yeah, she says, this is a sad day. And the story she told was, she said, the priest told me I had no soul. I have no soul. And it's not like she came back and said, I do have a soul, or I mean, she kind of left it there. And I said yesterday I said, Chief, that comment of that woman still bothers me to this day. And you tell that woman she has a soul and a spirit, and we need her. And this is what people are living with, right? She was very articulate. She relayed her story, but so it goes back to, it's not this historical past, it's this living history. And she's obviously thrilled and pleased where Chief Delorme is now taking child welfare and these types of things. So like I said, it's and some of these elders are the most forward-looking, forgiving people I've met in my life. And they're talking about, how do we build a healthy Canada, an inclusive Canada? If nothing motivates me more, it's those stories and role models of real reconciliation and action. And it's about forgiveness. Let's forget, and let's do build this new relationship together. So there's a story for the day. Thank you very much, folks, for joining in. That's the top of the hour. And I'm going to wish you all an early Merry Christmas here as we get ready for that. Thank you for your